Welcome everyone to People Keeping It Sacred, our program highlighting people who are keeping it sacred in this world. I'm Rabbi Heather Miller, founder of Keeping It Sacred, and I'm so excited to introduce you to today's guest, Dr. Professor Martina Ramirez. Dr. Martina Ramirez is the professor of evolutionary biology at Loyola Marymount University in California, and she has served at LMU for the past 22 years. Before that, at other institutions as well. She at LMU is the head of the Spider Lab, and her students love the Spider Club that she has. I can't wait to hear a little bit more about that as well. Dr. Ramirez also received an LGBTQ Mentor Award from LMU's LGBT Student Services offices. And along with that, has published 19 scientific papers, including 13 with undergraduate student co-authors. She lifts people up and is their champion, even as she herself has such amazing expertise. She's definitely a lifter up of society, like we like here at Keeping It Sacred. She also authored or co-authored a book called Happier as a Woman, Transforming Friendships, Transforming Lives. And that was out in 2019. Our paths connected on her journey toward Judaism, and it's a pleasure to study Talmud with her daily and reflect on the past week's Talmud together with Keeping It Sacred's Daf Yomi group. I would love for you to all welcome Dr. Martina Ramirez. Welcome, Martina. It's amazing to see you here.
Glad to be here.
I'm so glad to have you here. You are someone who really just jumped right into Keeping It Sacred and studied so much Talmud and studied, had such great questions. I know that as professors, professors also are lifelong learners, and you certainly are one of those. I wanted to see if you might like to start talking with us about some of the lessons that you've been learning along the way in your life.
So for me, institutions of higher education, they can be these transformative kind of vehicles for student lives. So I regularly work with students that are first generation, low income, some of them are undocumented, women of color, rural students, right? So all of these groups don't get a lot of support necessarily in higher ed spaces. So my sort of driving force in life has been to change up sort of the system to better open itself to these students that I work with. These students quite often come out of backgrounds where they've never been encouraged to think about sort of significant dreams that they might attain. Some of them have been given the subtle message to stay in your place, essentially. So I can see their talent, and I know what they're capable of. So over 4 years of college, let's say, I try to work with them basically as a personal trainer or an Olympic coach to train them up, provide them with the skills that they need to be an excellent scientist, an excellent scholar. But more than that, I try to model a way of being in the world that basically keeps ethics and justice kind of always kind of in your operating system. Because my students will go out into the world and they'll become degreed professionals. So they'll be in spaces where they now have gravitas, let's say. They're a chair of a department. They run kind of a medical floor in a hospital, what have you. So they're going to be in spaces where they're going to see things done not necessarily equally to all the people that kind of are in the workspace. So that's a chance for them to step up and stop that dysfunction. But they see a lot of examples in the world where the message basically is just play it safe. Don't rock the boat. The system might not like it if you point out its flaws. So they learn in me not just an example of how to be a scholar, they learn in me sort of the covert agenda of let's change up the world, because they see what I've done along the way to push against the system to make it better or more accepting. So for example, when I started as a faculty member in 91, my first job 30 years ago, you know, I was certainly in a situation where there were faculty that had an attitude of, if they're going to invite students into their research lab, I'm only going to pick the elite students, the ones that had really uppity high school backgrounds. So, so that was kind of like, unless you did that, you're kind of like suspect. Okay. So my approach to this was to make my lab kind of like a walk-on football team. We have only non-scholarship players. Okay. So I took pride in the fact that I never sent anyone away. With all these people, I never like took their academic records and, oh, let's see, are you like qualified? No, the entry thing was, are you chill with spiders? You know, they're not going to kill you. Okay, I'll help you. If you're fearful, you'll get over it. But my deal was, look, if you want to do this stuff, you can do it. So part of what I do over 4 years is try to change people's thinking about themselves, to help them sort of push back against the covert or overt messaging that they've gotten. The other thing is getting back to that attitude that I saw of faculty selecting only the best.
Mm.
My deal is training up my students to do as well or better than those sort of elite students that have been recruited. So you brought up the Spartacus plan a little while ago, which is my facetious name for what I've done. Because if you look in that 1960s movie, one of these classic Hollywood mega cool things, you know, 3 hours long, great lineup of actors. The fundamental story is about a gladiator who escapes. He incites a revolt of other gladiators and other servants, and all of a sudden there's this large army of like 100,000 escaped people running around defeating Roman armies in battle. Well, for me, that spoke loudly because the whole point of the gladiator system, in at least as the movie presents it, is that these people are brought in from conquered regions where the Roman Empire has subjugated peoples. They're brought in and trained up in training camps, how to fight, use weapons. But the point is, the end goal of that is they're supposed to go into the Colosseum and basically fight to the death. So here's the audience, thousands of people putting bets, putting money down, and who's going to die today and who's going to kill. So it's like using humans as sport.
Yeah.
But of course, these individuals were thought to be worth nothing, which is the whole point of, let's make them, you know, the human fodder for our entertainment. But the fact that when they got out, when this large revolt happened, people realized kind of subtly, like, oh my gosh, we trained them up so well. They're now beating our elite sons who are in our Roman legions. You know, they're beating them multiple times. Like, oh. So that spoke to me really loudly because that movie is really a metaphor for what I do with these students all the time.
Right, because you train them up in public speaking, you train them up in writing papers, you train them up in research and diligence and
sharing their story, telling their story to the public in a way the public can understand, not trying to use jargon that confuses and buries people.
I love that idea that you were talking about seeing the light within your students, that the external elite institutions that other students might come from is just kind of like the husk underneath, and underneath lies that kernel of wisdom and potential that each student brings. And with the amazing kind of a teacher that you are, I wondered, can you teach other people to see that light within every human being?
So one of the messages I give to my students that they pick up subtly or unsubtly is that they're supposed to, quote, keep the love going. Because they know, you know, I tell them sometimes, but they sort of figure out that they're my legacy to the world after I'm gone. So I try to model a life of, you're a professional, you're good at what you do, but you're always trying to think about the people around you. Basically, are you expanding the tent of inclusion? Are you pushing back against injustice, stupidity that's being directed towards others. So remember, one of the phrases that a colleague said to me over these 31 years, speaking about students basically at our institution, the quote was, "Oh, we don't have that high quality of a student body." So in other words, the things I was trying to expect students to do, have seminar classes when they're freshmen, get involved in research kind of early on, even in their first year. The whole idea of doing that was, quote, "Don't bother to do that with our students because they're not high quality enough to handle it." Kind of in my comeback to that is, why not the best? How do you know if you put high expectations out there that people aren't going to rise to it?
Right.
But so often with marginalized people, the thought is, oh, they're not worth our attention.
Right. People are written off before.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And the sad thing is, people living in that world, they start to believe it about themselves. So it's my mission to kind of sort of depopulate that nonsense that's kind of infected them, as it were. Because I can see that it's just stupid, right? Yeah. And I can see what they're capable of. So,
right.
So I have 4 years to help them believe in themselves better. So,
can you tell me how this connects with your own personal story? What lessons have you learned from your own personal story that now you're translating into the Spartacus plan and into your being a champion for people who are dismissed and overlooked?
So my origin story involves being an adopted child at 9 months in a maternity home in LA. So I was adopted into a Mexican American family out in Pomona, California. So they had grown up in the Depression. They never finished high school. They had 11 and 12 siblings on each side of the family. So it's hard financial times. So the older siblings go to work. So World War II comes. My dad goes to the war, comes back, gets his real estate license, gets his life insurance business going. So through the 1950s, he and my mom start becoming successful. So near the end of the decade, I appear in their world, which is great. But within about 2 years of being me being adopted, my dad was framed for embezzlement because of his race, because he had the audacity to get involved in political activities, basically in a town where it was historically segregated, with an all-male city council. So here's the ruling class. So my dad was considered to be a problem, so he was eliminated. So after he was convicted, he was incarcerated. They lost their homes. So the earliest memories I have are not of these nice houses that I saw in pictures years later, but being in broken down rentals, living in a garage, living in a car for a few days. So life was hard. So their goal was to destroy his trajectory towards success, and they clearly did it. So I grew up in a town where there was gangs, there was drugs. Out of my 8th grade class, there were people that were incarcerated, that were killed in drug deals, that had kids out of wedlock. So if you're someone out of my town that became something, that was the exception. So I was always worried about survival. I didn't want to become a statistic because I had seen what the ruling class had done to my dad. So I always felt that I was in a video game to some extent, dodging characters or obstacles appearing on the scene, because I could see casualties along the way, peers of mine even. So I had this survivor mentality, but I also became very connected religiously to this idea that humanity is a wonderful thing. People reflect God. So I saw all this injustice going on around me, and it didn't compute because some of the same people doing the injustice go to church, say they believe this or that. but yet their day-to-day activities didn't mesh with what they said they believed. For me, that never made sense. So I've always tried to align my activities in the world with what I believe.
Very much like Isaiah, when Isaiah says, are these the fasts that I require? Like, I don't want you to do these ritual things. I want you to live justice for the orphan, for the widow, for the stranger. Like, live it. Don't just say it and then make your ritual sacrifices. Do it, actually doing it.
So the idea of going through the motions versus really buying in and believing kind of in your whole being, like, here's kind of what you need to do. So that was my thing in life. But along the way, I realized that I was different, that I was trans. So I spent decades trying to think about, because so remember, I didn't have health coverage most of my life. I didn't have dental care until I came to college, I think. So if you were poor as we were, you just put up with things. You hoped you didn't get sick. So I was pretty lucky in that realm because I was a pretty healthy kid. But I became aware along the way that there were people that were doing gender transitions, but they tended to have personal wealth, which gave them access to medical expertise, guidance, financial support, psychological support, what have you. So I knew what was possible, but I could never ever see having access to any of that. The other thing is I was moving through the world as a person of color from a marginalized background. So I was in spaces where there were people trying to stop me. So to some extent, for me, pretending that I wasn't trans for a while was safety. Because I was clearly in spaces where people were going to squish you. So it was like, it's bad enough that you're a brown person. So now you're going to be this too? Okay. So I had that sort of challenge trying to go through life for a long time, pretending to some extent. So that wasn't easy. The reason I never drifted into depression or suicidal thoughts was, for me, the other matter of pushing for justice, trying to be a vehicle for people to realize their dreams. For me, that was an important mission. And for me, it was really more important than myself. So that's why kind of I was able to deal with this dissonance, as it were, for so long. But at some point in my 50s, I'd had enough of pretending. So, and I was established enough where I gather, safe. So, and of course, society had changed. There was now major health plans that had gender transition coverage. There were now policies in universities, et cetera, to protect people. There was nothing like that in the past.
Your story is so beautiful because you have it from both sides, right? You've been the one who has been boxed into and pressurized into limits, and you have also understood what that feels like to have that potential and to be marginalized in that way, discriminated against, and put in dangerous situations. And you've also had that experience of yourself being able to eventually flourish and be your full self in all that you are. And you've been able to do that for students and show students why that is a beautiful thing, and to build this world that allows for everybody to be able to flourish and be their whole selves, and to show exactly how the world is better for it. The world is better for it that you have been able to be yourself. And now you've allowed all of these other people to be themselves. And, think of, how much more knowledge we have about spiders, how much more, knowledge we have about medicine and doing good things in the world, and that, sharing the love and spreading that forward, that message of love, those ripples that come out from you and your story, and teaching that lesson that you don't ever want to squash people, that you always want to ensure that everybody flourishes, because everyone does flourish when everyone flourishes. A human being can have a stamp and stamp out coins, and every single coin will be exactly the same as the next. But God can have a stamp that creates human beings, and not two of them will be exactly alike. And that idea that every human being is intentionally created different from the next, and beautiful and unique in their own right, and that ability to see that beauty and that uniqueness in every human being. It just feels so Jewish to me what you've been doing with this, training people up to be their full selves and to be fully expressive of who they are. It also reminds me of the Rabbi Zusia story, where Rabbi Zusia is this great and learned sage, and he's on his deathbed, and he looks worried, and his students say, Rabbi Zusia, what could you possibly be worried about? You're this amazing teacher and this amazing person your whole life. And he says, my students, I'm just worried that I wasn't enough like Moses. And he dies, and the idea is that when he finally meets God, God looks at him disappointedly and says, Rabbi Zusia, I was not trying to see if you were going to be a better Moses than Moses. I didn't want you to be Moses. I just wanted you to be Rabbi Zusia. And that idea, the way that you've trained up your students to be their full selves in all that they are and their uniqueness, it just feels so Jewish to me, the way that you have lived, and the way that you live, the way that your lab works, the way that your life has unfolded.
So having grown up in the Latino Catholic Church, so that world was a very rich one. There's a lot of love, a lot of ritual, a lot of ceremony. The thing that struck me about the Catholic Church, there's two aspects to it to some extent. The part that I really connected with was the commitment of the church to the marginalized, to the poor, to working with them for their betterment, for their building up. Of course, there's another part of the church that is about doctrine, creed, belief. So on that side, there are things that are not favorable to LGBTQ people. So while I had a great time in the church because of its commitment to those who are marginalized, not considered worthy of love, at the same time I had challenges or issues living in a world where being who I was, who I might love, would be considered problematic. So for a number of years, I stepped away from practice in the church. So I started reading about other Abrahamic faith traditions. July of 2019, I'm reading a book written by a Jesuit that contrasts Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in terms of how they approach major matters such as covenant. They're like compare and contrast. Really neat. So at some point, not long after that, I started dating someone from New York, a New York Jewish grandma who moved to the San Fernando Valley of California. So then in short order, I was part of this big, happy Jewish family, going to life cycle events. Her sister is a board member at a synagogue in the west end of the valley. So now I'm in synagogue services on Friday night and realizing there's women cantors, women rabbis. And you realize at some point, some of them are in same-sex relationships and they're not hiding.
Amazing.
Amazing. In the world where I came from, you would not see that. So that was striking to me. But again, seeing the love, the laughter, the warmth that I saw in this big, happy Jewish family, it was very much like my life growing up in a Hispanic Catholic family. So in short order, I contacted LMU's Hillel rabbi, Zach Zisman, we started talking. So then about February of 20, January of 20, we had our first formal conversion meetings. So we did that in person, then COVID arrived. We did it in Zoom. So then I'd gone through a conversion course with him. Then I started learning Hebrew fall of last year. So I continue to do Hebrew now. Somehow I found my way to keeping it sacred and you, which has been a blessing in my life. It's starting to get to know the people in the Zoom rooms, realizing the wonderment of people studying Torah together, the Talmud together, different views, different thoughts, kind of the love that's in that room when people pray for each other, when one person has a sickness or they aren't there for a reason because of some issue. It's like this loving world. And it's virtual for the moment anyway, but I look forward to meeting those people some way, somehow, if it's possible after COVID recedes. But that was a huge benefit for me because I was really missing the world that I had seen before COVID. The other thing that attracted me to Judaism is basically in a really fundamental way is, so I picked up that there was an emphasis more so on what you do in the world than on a system of belief. Because my impression of Christianity and Catholicism especially was the barrier to entering the fold was, here's this belief system, sign up. So if you don't buy into the belief system, sorry, you're not welcome. In Judaism, my impression was there seemed to be a lot of latitude for beliefs, kind of in what that looked like. But the more important thing is, how do you take Torah and live it in the world? Bring it into your day-to-day life, which fit with me a whole lot. Because when I was in the world of Catholicism, it really wasn't the fine details of theology that kind of did it for me. It was really, how do you take the gospel values and put them to work in the world? So,
Right.
so Judaism's emphasis fit with me really well. So
There's a story about a new rabbi to a town, and his new congregants hear that his friend from growing up is going to be coming. So they're like, okay, now we can find out more about who this guy really is from his beginnings. So his old friend comes to the town and they say, well, did you notice anything interesting about this rabbi? Is there anything we should know about his growing up? And he's like, no, he was just like a really good guy. He's a good friend. And well, actually, there was this one thing. And they're like, really, what is it? What's this one thing? And he says, no, there was this one field trip that we were on, and we went up the side of this mountain, and it became like a hill on top, and it was really pretty. And it was time to go, so we all came down the hill, and the teacher was counting us off and realized someone was missing. We realized it was this guy. And so our teacher decided to go back up the mountain and go see where he was, what happened. And when he got to the top, he found him face down, hugging the mountain, because he was so in awe of this beautiful place that he was in. And that story always stuck with me, because you realize that you can find awe and beauty and appreciation for the natural world in Judaism. That is a thing, and that's a beautiful thing to lift up. And also that that there's a simplicity to it, that, you know, you can strip away all of the ritual and all of the language and all of, you know, the Hebrew and the, you know, the candles and the wine and the spices. You strip it all away, and at the end of the day, the core of it is just that gratitude for the creation around you, including your own life. Where can we find you, and what projects do you want our audience to know about?
So there is an LMU website for each faculty. So my info is there. But so I'm pretty open about people contacting me on Facebook, my email, what have you. I respond to people basically 24 hours a day. I'm happy to contact and talk to people about whatever, the book, about spiders, what have you. Keep in mind, the fact that people have spiders in their yards or their homes, I tell people I do house calls. So it's not uncommon for people to take a picture on their phone of a spider, and then they text it to me. What is this? Should I be worried? No, it's not going to kill you. But sometimes they find really cool things in their house or their yard. So then it's like, okay, I'll be over. That's important. Leave it alone. I'll bring a student with me, what have you. So yes, we've done that as well. So you never know what people will find. Sometimes it's really important stuff. And it's like, okay, we're going to be there now. That becomes a scientific visit, basically. So some other aspect that has driven my desire to help people is the fact that I could never presume that there would be people in my world. So part of my reverence for people basically is out of gratitude that they appear in my world at all.
And can you tell us a little bit about your book and where we can get it? And
so yes, the book can be found on Amazon. It can be found in Barnes and Noble. It's pretty widely distributed. It's also in Europe as well on some sites out there. So if you just Google "Happier as a Woman," it'll pop up. Our goals was to write something that was much different than the quote standard trans narrative. Because from what I've seen, at least, a number of trans narratives have the perspective that kind of goes like this, which is that your old life was filled with challenges and hardship. Then you enter the promised land of having transitioned and the life is wonderful. So you essentially forget the life that you had before or try to minimize it. For me, that never made any sense because I had this grand goal of changing the world person by person, building up those around me. That was my driving force. As I said earlier, that was fundamentally more important to me than my gender situation out in the world, basically of being intersectional identities. So you can be several things at once. That was clearly my situation. So we tried to tell the book in that perspective. So that's how our book is really distinctly different than anything I've ever seen. And that was the point. So
much richness to your experience, so many layers to your experience.
So yes, I hope people enjoy it. I'd never written a book before, so it was an adventure for me. So.
Well, thank you so much for sharing so much of your heart, and thank you. It's such a pleasure and a joy to know you and to know how you exist in the world and how you just magnify the joy and the appreciation for others. It's such a pleasure. And I want to also thank our audience for tuning in. If you have someone that you'd like to recommend that we host on the show, please contact us at Rabbi Miller at keepingitsacred.com, or you can go to keepingitsacred.com and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date with all of our programming opportunities to study together and more. So with that, I'd like to say thank you everyone for keeping it sacred. Be well.